Hey there, big guys. The name's Akash. I'm here to teach about the Aztecs. I know it's a bit strange to listen to a 15-year-old on a shitty iPhone talk to you about some random Mesoamerican empire that maybe some of you never even heard about. But yeah, actually, I don't know why you'd be here either. I'm just reading the potential viewers of this beautiful documentary that I'm about to make. Or maybe this is like a class, right? The 1% chance that I'm being shown in a class. In which case, miss, do not worry. Every little brat here, I got you. Hello. I don't know what side you're on. But like that guy, for example, he's definitely on his phone. Or maybe that girl over there in the corner. I just have a little feeling about it. Or maybe the person watching this like on a laptop or something, he's watching his phone right now. In which case, stop. Cut that out, because now it's time to listen to me. Because it is time for you to get your knowledge on the Aztecs through the comprehensive guide to the Aztecs. Nice of you to join us, folk. Let's begin with Aztlan, the supposed homeland of the Aztecs. A beautiful place, sprawling with so much riches everywhere. But nah, it didn't actually exist. I mean, it might have, but the general area that we think the Aztec people come from is around New Mexico, but there was no documented place called Aztlan that people could find. However, even Aztec is not even the right term. Aztec Empire ain't either. It kind of comes from the whole Spanish conquering thing, and it's not what the people themselves refer to, because they were actually the Triple Alliance, which we'll get into later, of course. But the term for the people in this Aztec Empire were the Mexicas. And the Mexicas, they came from modern-day New Mexico, maybe northern Mexico as well, and the way we know this is because I myself did an interview with this really chill guy, right? His name was Walter, top dog. You can watch this, where I ask him where he's from.
My name is Walter Hartwell White. I live at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 87104.
As you heard from Walter, he's from New Mexico, right? So are all the Mexica people. And they got wind of the fact that a huge empire, powerhouse there, had just fallen, leaving a huge power vacuum to be filled. This empire was the Mayans. The Mayans fell. Many tribes all over the Mexican peninsula and the whole Mesoamerica region, they started migrating down, right? Because they wanted to try and use this new opportunity to bolster their own power, get more wealth. So when the Mexicas started migrating from the north towards the central basin, the whole Yucatan Peninsula place, they faced many hardships. Even when they reached there, they found feudalistic city-states, basically. They were already settled there. Yeah, and it's crazy. A lot of people think that the whole institution of feudalism was a very old world, Asia, Europe type thing, but no, not at all. There were feudalistic kingdoms, at least very close to feudalism in the in Mexico, right? So yeah, they settled down there. They faced even more hardships. Huge thousands of their people were slaughtered due to a few slip-ups that they made. And all these experiences really goes to show the whole idea of the Mexica culture, a culture that has adapted through every single hardship that they had faced, except for the Spanish, of course. And the way they came out was basically getting a huge understanding on military. They knew they needed to be strong to survive. If they weren't strong, they just wouldn't survive. It was as simple as that. And that is why the Aztecs were so militaristic. All these hardships that they faced, they came up with very violent solutions, which is why we know that, you know, the sacrifices, the flower wars, just all constant violence. We think that basically comes and originates from their culture being involved in all these hardships. Of course, the human sacrifices, in a way, it is justified, right? The human sacrifice was brought to Mexico by the Olmecs. The Mayans also were doing human sacrifices, and it was the norm of any city-state, any empire that was in that region. If you didn't sacrifice, it was actually kind of weird because their religion dictated so. That was their whole thing. It was their version of normal. If they had come to us and see us not sacrificing people, they would think we are a bit like savage and stuff, you know? So yeah, sacrifice, all that cool stuff, right? The religion of the Mexica. What was their religion? Well, they were primarily polytheists, which means they had multiple gods in a pantheon, right? So you had one main god whose name was, and this is gonna be hard for me and you, Huitzilopochtli, and he was the main god, a god of war, sun, and a few other stuff, and the majority of sacrifices would be towards him. There were many other minor gods as well, and on the main pyramid that I think most people know of when they think about the Aztecs, that was in their city capital, Tenochtitlan, is dedicated to basically three gods. Yeah, we had 3 temples, 1, 2, 3. The middle one, which was the biggest, was for Huitzilopochtli, right? So they had this whole idea of the fact that they needed sacrifices to be able to, you know, keep delivering the farms for their people, keep delivering successes in battle, which is why later on they would even have, you know, these little tribes within the huge sea of that there was their border that were still alive, kept only to be murdered, and they basically used it as training for young men. When a Spanish conquistador asked a question to Moctezuma II, who was basically the last emperor of the Aztec people, he basically said that the reason they had left this tribe alive, this kingdom alive, was to train more men and to ensure there was a steady supply of manpower. The true legitimacy of this statement, and if the fact that the Spanish conquistador even said that, asked that, or Moctezuma even replied with that, you can't know, right? It wasn't. It's not an official document written by the Aztecs themselves. This whole concept, it's called flower wars or garland wars. They did have a term for this in their language, Nahuatl, but it is not sure how realistic the whole violence was, but it is true that there was a kingdom within the Aztec borders that eventually did ally with the Spanish. All this we'll get into later, right? But that was the culture and the religion of the Aztec people, or the Mexica as I should really be calling it, right? So now let's get into the really fun stuff, the rise of the Mexica, right? So they came to they came to this place called Lake Texcoco, right? And around there was basically like 3 big kingdoms, right? You have a kingdom on the south, the west, and the east, right? And so I think the first kingdom that these Aztecs or the Mexicas approached for was in the south, basically, right? They had approached diplomatically because the previous kingdom that they approached very violently and they got their asses kicked, right? So they approached diplomatically, they asked for land, and then, I kid you not, right? They got their land. It was inhospitable land. They farmed it, they settled it so well, it became very fertile, and then they asked to marry the daughter of the local ruler, right? They sacrificed her, and then the priest wore her skin, then went to the king And like, I don't know what exactly the whole plan was with visiting the king, wearing the skin of his daughter, but the king ordered that every single Mexica person in those lands to be murdered. The Mexica, they tried to put up some resistance, some fled, majority of them died. They went into the Lake Texcoco, where they found like a little island there, right? A little island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, which they would come to know as Tenochtitlan, a huge city. Eventually would be a huge city that you can even rival to Venice City with the whole canal system that they had, right? But that was still hundreds of years to go, right? Or not really, but that was still pretty far away. They still had to compete with the local tribes that lived on the island, and they slowly consolidated their power. They eradicated every other tribe, or maybe they just indoctrinated them into their tribe, and they created a actually decently strong city-state. The city-state is now on the map again for each of these kingdoms. The kingdom before, they kind of did forget about what they had done previously to the daughter of that old ruler, right? And so the Aztec people, they approached the king, right? They wanted to get involved in all that trade. Now here's a special thing to make sure everybody understands, right? The way most kingdoms work is that they would have one main city-state. For the Triple Alliance or Aztec Empire, for the Mexicas, basically, this main city-state would be Tenochtitlan. Every other city in their kingdom was, technically speaking, a vassal. It had a lot more autonomy, right? Comparing to a city that a kingdom in like France owned, right? Maybe like Chartres. It didn't have that kind of autonomy that the city-states in the whole Mesoamerica region would have, right? So these kingdoms, they had city-states in return for protection from the main city-state, which would often be the largest and most powerful. They would be paying tribute, but they would also get free trade. There were many positives and many drawbacks involved in being a vassalage under your the main city-state, right? So when the Aztecs had negotiated trade settlements, which basically dictated free trade between the Tenochtitlan and all the city-states inside that kingdom, the city-states got mad. These people were infringing on their right. They weren't even vassalized. They had 100% autonomy. They could do whatever they want, and they get to trade, benefiting from all that, right? So they came to the king, they negotiated with him, and basically, one leads to another. The Mexicas are now subjects because they can't put up any resistance. They learned from their mistakes. They didn't bother trying to fight. So they decided, all right, we'll be your vassals. And through a whole set of circumstances, which would eventually lead to the Mexica people rebelling against the king, right? The thing is, this was very good for them. The position they were in was very good. Even though they were a vassal, they were pretty much out of reach from the king. So they were really able to stack up their power. They consolidated. And before the time of rebellion, which basically happened because an entire royal bloodline was killed, right? And only one guy was left from the whole bloodline, which is the nobles elected, right? That was another thing about the Tenochtitlan. They were, in fact, an elective monarchy, basically. So yeah, they allied other kingdoms and they went to war with the main kingdom. And once they won this war, this would be when the whole idea of the Tenochtitlan being an independent city-state that would soon come to thrive and dominate, this is where it originated. Because basically, they split up the land with their other allies. There were three allies they had, and two allies they had, and these three nations, Tenochtitlan and the other two, would come to be the Triple Alliance. These two nations were independent throughout the entirety of Aztec history, but they're not. But they eventually, the Aztecs, they outgrow them so much that they kind of become irrelevant to the whole political scene, other than in a few places regarding the whole flower wars I was talking about earlier. But basically, the Tenochtitlan was the top dog. They expanded, and after 14 long years of rule under the first ever independent king of the Tenochtitlan, well, he died, and he left a huge empire to be succeeded, and the nobles would be electing militaristic rulers, so the expansion would just keep growing, and growing until, well, as you know it, they reach their height of power. Now let's get into the specifics. Itzcoatl is the name of that ruler I was talking about that won the Aztecs or the Mexicas their independence war. And it will be under him that the Mexicas would conquer huge swathes of territory, and basically upon his death, they were considered top dog, right? They had their allies as well, the other two nation states. While they were considerably smaller, they were no threat. They were no joke. They did have threats to other kingdoms nearby. And basically this guy, right, he and any other ruler that would come after him, even a guy like Moctezuma, which was another absolute chad of a ruler, right, they would have one problem, and it was the fact that they always needed to be at war. This was because of the class system that the Aztecs had. The class system was divided into three: the nobles, the priests, and the warriors. Or sorry, four. Sorry, I'm a bit stupid right now. You had the warriors, the priests, the nobles, of course, and the commoners, right? Let's start ground level, the commoners. Basically, the average citizen who were primarily farmers, of course, right? There's no industrial stuff to do. So most of them basically were in farming industry. Some of them were like blacksmiths. And basically, they needed a lot of land, right? Because if most of them are farmers, and your entire economic system revolves around agriculture, because fun fact, their economic system relied on cocoa beans, right? If land is what you need for more agriculture, and more agriculture is what you need to have a better economy, and a better economy is what you need for sustaining a massive army that one would typically have or need for having so many city-states. Because remember, these city-states have autonomy. They can revolt anytime they want to. You need a big army as a Mesoamerican ruler to make sure that you're getting as much tribute as possible, fighting as little with your city-states as possible to avoid devastating your own lands. Because basically the main form of devastation would only come through wars. There were no plagues in Mesoamerica. Sure, there was disease. Obviously, you can't have no disease. But there were no huge plagues. So, yeah, they always needed to be at war because they needed more land, because they needed to fund their agricultural gains so that their peasants would all have places to work. But when they expanded, they got more peasants, so they needed more land to work. But then they would get more peasants, so they needed more land to work. And they just constantly needed land to make sure their growing army would be sustained efficiently with a growing economy, right? And unlike many European nations, which actually heavily deteriorate their economy through war, technically speaking, the Aztec economy was thriving at this point, right? Because they probably had a bunch of cocoa beans, right? But it is impossible. Like Sun Tzu said, a great Chinese general, there's no instance of a nation having been benefited from prolonged warfare. And we'll get into this later. The internal crises that would come from being at war constantly is horrible, right? You can't handle that efficiently if you want a good ruler. The Aztecs, the Mexicas, they got lucky at first. They had so many good rulers, Itzcoatl, Moctezuma, and even the rulers in between them were really good at leading armies and conquering provinces. As long as your army is good, you will thrive. And that is how it worked in Mesoamerica. It was the literal definition of, the strongest survive, right? Only the fittest live. So yeah, those are the commoners, right? They were one of the classes, and they dictated that you'd need more land. And this trend comes in with every single class, right? Let's move up one. Warriors. They were the backbone of the entire Aztec Empire, like I just explained, right? And every soldier that would contribute to this, to any war, would get some land. And you can just see how this goes. They get more soldiers who also work part-time as farmers in between wars. They get more soldiers, they do more wars, so they need to give more land to their soldiers. They run out of land, so they need to do more wars. They eventually get more soldiers, more land needed. so more wars, and they get more like, it's a whole cycle with the commoners and the warriors, right? They constantly need land so that they don't rise up, they don't instill these ideas of liberty against Tenochtitlan. Because another thing the warriors were very good for was keeping in check every single city-state. If they weren't there, if they weren't ready to be called upon in a time of need, then any city-state could completely remain completely autonomous, not giving a single bit of tribute to Tenochtitlan. And Tenochtitlan was a very big city. The architecture in Tenochtitlan is magnificent. I mean, I am completely enthralled by it. It is one of the best cities, historical cities that I've ever seen. And it probably cost a lot to actually maintain. So you can imagine that the Aztecs, they really needed that tribute, right? Let's move up once more. The priests. The priests were very, very influential, because if the religion is influential enough that everybody believes that human sacrifice is the most normal thing possible, you know that the representatives of said religion would be viewed very prominently, right? So the religious people, they wanted sacrifices, and majority of sacrifices, if to be considered legitimate, would have to be like, you know, horrible criminals or soldiers from an enemy nation in war. If you wanted to please your priests, right, and you didn't want them to revolt against you or just, you know, cause problems, you need to give them what they want, sacrifices, because sacrifices kind of dictated the religious authority that they had, and they wanted as much religious authority as possible, right? And you cannot have enough human sacrifices if you don't do much wars. If you remain at peace all the time, there's no nations to fight. Where are you going to get enemy soldiers to sacrifice if you don't have enemy soldiers in the first place, right? Another thing, and this is where the flower wars I was talking about came from, right? There were documented historical records from Spanish descendants that came from the interbreeding between the Spanish and the Mexicans, right, that would report that the flower wars was kind of a thing. It did have some legitimacy, right there, because we know, as I mentioned, there was a couple of nations within the borders of the Aztec Empire, particularly in the Pueblo Valley, and these nations were big, right? They were independent. They were completely autonomous. There was no sign of them ever paying a bit of tribute, unless it dictated so in a peace terms of a war, right? So time and time again, when maybe during a new batch of conscripts or drafts, these nations would get attacked, right? But here's where the legitimacy comes into question, because the Aztecs lost quite a few battles to them. So you really start to wonder if maybe it's not the fact that they were alive because the Aztecs wanted them to be so, but maybe they were only alive because the Aztecs couldn't actually conquer them. Maybe the whole idea of flower wars was propaganda towards the people, right? So to make sure that they were seen as strong, because it was these independent kingdoms within the borders that would basically make the kingdom capitulate, right? With the help from the Spanish, of course. They allied the Spanish, they sieged Tenochtitlan, they won, it was their manpower. They were clearly skilled at war. And also, if you're in constant warfare, it's not only one side that gains the experience. Both sides do gain the experience, right? So that's why the whole flower wars idea would justify one of the reasons for why the priests wanted constant war, but it also could very well be propaganda, because there were many, many dead Aztecs lying on the ground after one battle. And I personally think that it is propaganda, and that the Aztecs could never conquer this kingdom, because there was a rivalry. And this is not some new thing, right? Because up to the north of the Aztecs was another nation, right? These two nations would have the first proper borders between them, because they had better technology than the Aztecs. When Axcoatl, which was the successor after Moctezuma, and Moctezuma was kind of like the first emperor, you could say, right? He expanded so much, right? So Axcoatl went to war with this nation, because basically every single emperor or king would go to war like right at the beginning to prove their legitimacy, like how Catholic kings and queens would get crowned by a cardinal or a pope to prove their legitimacy, these guys had to go to war. So yeah, they went to war and they lost, and it was a huge mark. It was a huge stain, and basically from Axcatl was when the Aztecs would start disintegrating, because they constantly started losing wars, rebellions would happen, the economy was draining, they weren't getting enough tribute, and all these would factor in. And then the Spanish decided that was just a perfect time to discover these guys, right? So anyways, that was the priests. Now the pinnacle of this, of course, other than the royal family themselves, were the nobility. The nobility's power goes to show why it is so important to keep your nobility in check if you are a ruler in the medieval age or even post Renaissance age. You know, they had complete dictation over who became king. What they would choose is militaristic kings because they wanted more power. If the nobles because the nobles controlled a portion of the peasants, right? Their peasants would gain more land, the soldiers would gain more land because there would be more wars. If they chose militaristic kings, there would be more wars in general, and they would have more land, and thus they would have more power within the entire court, right? So that is why they influenced every single election to vote for people who they deemed militaristic. And these militaristic kings, the majority of what they knew was pure military stuff, right? Bureaucracy, administration, diplomacy was dead in the water, all right? Because the majority of kings focused purely on conquest and violence, nothing else. Pure blood spilling over the fields of Mesoamerica was what every Aztec king post Moctezuma envisioned, right? And it's not like every Aztec king was even good at it. Tizoc was a complete failure. I can guarantee, if you're watching this, you are better than that guy. He lost to one of the smallest rebellions that the Aztecs would have normally faced. He lost to it. I cannot believe how, when I was reading about this, I was infuriated. But yeah, the nobility, very influential, and because of them is why every Aztec king wanted so much war, right? And a bit pro tip for anybody watching this and planning to become kings. Another reason you should consider putting your nobility in check. It's not just the Aztecs that had this problem. You know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, well, they had similar problems to this, right? So if you want to be a king, make sure your nobility are in check. All right, that's a pro tip from myself. The Aztecs they had a sprawling, vast amount of territory to their name, and they had a strong military. There's no doubt about this. So why exactly did they collapse? Was the Spanish force that eventually invaded them really that powerful? No, not really. In fact, I'd attribute 50% or even more of their entire downfall to internal crisis. You see, just like I think any European medieval realm, they had one big problem: their kings. As I explained before, the nobles would oftentimes choose militaristic kings, and they had kept with this tradition far after the fact that the Aztecs started limiting where they could actually go and how much they could actually keep. There was a cap. You can't expand and expand and expand and expand without expecting to start having bureaucracy and administration issues. You know, it is fully possible that city-states far away from their capital, Tenochtitlan, would be paying even less tribute and getting away with it, because the fact is they're running out, their resources are starting to be spread thin. And another issue, what I mentioned about the kings, if all of them are militaristic, then nobody can come up with bureaucratic and administrative reforms to help combat this problem. So the nobles, they kept electing militaristic kings, and sometimes they even elected complete failures of kings like Tizoc, as I mentioned. And this whole trend continued. Moctezuma II, he was all right. The thing is, there was nothing too special about him. He did conquer quite a bit to the south, but ultimately the empire would end with him. So let's discuss some of those reasons of why the empire ended in the first place. As I mentioned, internal crisis. Moctezuma's militaristic campaigns weren't seeing the same amount of success that someone like Itzcoatl or Moctezuma I would have. So, understandably, a lot of the city-states started vying for independence. And I mean, this is a trend. Even in every ruler's entire rule, right, in every king's rule, there would be a couple of city-states that would try to vie for independence because they think, oh, look at this opportunity here, I can grasp it, and boom, that's it. I'm independent now. I have my own autonomy. I can do whatever I want, right? But it was starting to really build up because the couple of city-states goes to tens and 20 city-states, because that's just how many cities and vassals that they have under them, right? And it becomes really hard to balance military expanding to prove the might of the army to crushing rebellions to prove the might of the army. The army, you can't be at war forever. The armies are made up of human beings. You can't expect that the humans are going to be constantly in action, fighting, not a single break. And as I mentioned, those armies needed land, right? Because the soldiers, every soldier that participated actively in war, they would need land. That's how the system worked. They would get promoted based on how many sacrifices they captured. Interesting little fact there. And if they, I think, like, if the ranks were higher, if they did more work, they'd get more land. But as I mentioned, Brand was running out to give to them. So they hit a cap of territory they could hold, and ultimately they hit a cap of how much land they could be giving out, which means they hit a cap of the army. And if you hit a cap of an army, especially as a nation like the Aztecs, that's not good for you. So now more and more city-states are vying for independence, and it's constant rebellions at Moctezuma. It's hard to start keeping up with them, right? So that's one major issue. And you'll see this because the city-states vying for independence, they ally with the Spanish. They know fully well. I have no doubt that there were many of them that doubted the hostility or the amiability of the Spanish that came, right? I'm pretty sure most of them saw them as hostile, but yet they still chose to ally with them. And in the end, they got exploited. And it was not a good look for them. They had overthrown their old suzerain overlord, and now they have a new one, which is more oppressive, and it's even harder to revolt against them because of their technology, right? So this issue, internal rebellions and disloyal vassals, with how the government and mechanics worked over there, it's just a horrible mix of ingredients that ultimately create pure chaos and just complete crumbling of the empire, right? And this land, a lot of land in Mesoamerica was very infertile, right? And most of the times, the soldiers would actually be given this infertile land because the fertile land would have to be spared towards the farmers who actually did farm full-time, no distractions like having to go to war or whatever, right? They started running out of this. And as I mentioned before as well, cocoa beans were like a primary part of their economy. They were very, very valuable. They were seen as very royal as well. The Aztecs had a lot of gold, and it was this common gold, right, because of how common it was, that actually made it not as valuable as what us Europeans had thought of it, right? Gold was a currency, right? You had ducats, individual nation currencies, but gold is what everybody wanted, right? So the Spanish came, right? They found all this gold, and they were surprised to see that gold was kind of like a gem, right? In the fact that it looks good, you give it out as royal gifts, but it was not valuable. It was not even, it wasn't close to as valuable as cocoa beans were, interestingly enough. So yeah, they started running out of land because cocoa beans, you can't feed a population with cocoa beans, and cocoa beans are already used for their economy. And if they're running out of land to balance between having cocoa beans so that you can keep supplying, you can keep maintaining your cities, and you also need food so you can maintain your population, then that balance gets out of hand. You have to choose, is it going to be 60%, 40%, 30%, 70%, because 50% won't work. Either it's going to be a mix of too small a population and too small an economy, so you need more balance of the other. And this is a huge dilemma. and there's not much land to conquer, because all the land that was fertile, most of it has already been conquered. Other lands that are fertile are locked behind nations with better technology and that have previously defied Aztec rule or domination, right? So they can't go push there either. And all the other land is just like marshy, infertile, just not proper land to use for farming. And so what are they supposed to do? That's another part where the economy starts crumbling. And if the economy starts crumbling, then once again that army reaches another cap. The army keeps getting blocked. And the army, I don't think I can stress how important the army was for the Aztec nation. It was so much more important than even than a European nation having an army, you know? Because in Europe, things were pretty much more stable internally. Yes, there were rebellions, and yes, it could get out of hand, 30 years war, France's wars, wars of religion, all that stuff. But the thing is, if you were a relatively small nation, you wouldn't need an army. Even if you're a small nation in America and Mesoamerica, you need an army. So that's why all these caps, all these limiters that the Aztecs were facing due to their expansion proving to be like a double-edged sword, basically stabbing them by inefficient bureaucracy and administration, and also providing not enough land and too much population for their entire country, right? So that's number 2 reason. And the third reason, well, I think you know what the third reason is. The Spanish Empire had arrived into Mesoamerica. Some of the first documented interactions between the Spanish and the Mexica, or at least Mexica sightings of the carracks, right, the heavy ships, heavy battleships that the Spanish were bringing in under Hernan Cortez. It said, and I quote, "It seemed like the mountains were moving along the seas." Right? So it was completely novel to any Mexican person to see this absolute beast of a wooden structure sailing through the ocean. It was probably much faster than any of their boats, right? And so much bigger. Now let's talk about the actual Spanish crew or Spanish team that arrived in Mesoamerica, right, in the Aztec Empire. It was under one Hernan Cortez, and funnily enough, it was never an official mission given by the Spanish monarch. It was something Cortez did under his own volition, because he was finding that he didn't have, he was greedy, right? He wanted more stuff. He arrived to Spanish Cuba, and basically he was a bit sad to see that he wasn't getting enough opportunities, getting enough gold, getting enough money, that he was, what he envisioned, right? So he starts sailing to, he first lands in the Mayan areas, right? He has a few scuffles with them, And basically he learns of an empire of gold, and this empire of gold obviously is the Aztec Empire. Over there he picks up a translator who can speak the Mayan language and the Aztec language. He already has a crew member that can speak the Mayan language, so through this whole interlinked thing, he understands the Aztec language, Nahuatl, right? And this girl who translated Nahuatl into the Mayan language would eventually be the wife of Hernan Cortez, right? Interesting stuff. Another thing about Cortez's crew, not many soldiers. Barely any soldiers, actually. He had a few cannons, maybe a few horses, but primarily he had regular sailors, regular colonists, and maybe a few conquistadors here and there, right? So he lands, I think, a bit north to the Yucatan Peninsula, right? And he basically claims this land as his, much to the surprise of any Mexican residents over there. But the Mexicans, they're very confused, and they are a bit scared because these guys are clad in steel skin, basically, with weapons and beasts, because they had never seen horses before, right? So they were scared. They talked to Moctezuma. Moctezuma eventually got wind of this news. He kind of didn't care, because the internal crises that I mentioned, they were getting out of hand. So at first, he did not care. Cortez started marching towards the capital to directly meet with Moctezuma II, and over there, he crosses past, well, the nation within the borders of the Aztecs, right, with the whole flower war propaganda, basically, right? He crosses by that nation. That nation attacks him. He barely holds out. If he had not been able to get peace with them, that entire thing would have probably just ended on the spot right there, right? So he negotiates with them. And basically there's an alliance in place, and most of the manpower would ultimately be coming from this nation when they actually siege down and fight for Tenochtitlan. So Cortez moves into Tenochtitlan eventually, right? And along with the Spanish come disease that the Mexicas have no clue how to cure at all. They don't know anything that could properly work, right? The influenza was starting to run amok everywhere, right? And this crippled Aztec manpower. Can you imagine, after all the things I said about why the army was there and the reasons, and the things that would happen if the army wasn't there, that now there was a dire need of manpower? I think you can already see that the Aztecs are now doomed to fall, right? So the Spanish come, right? They basically, you could kind of consider it a peaceful invasion of Tenochtitlan, because at the end of the day, eventually Moctezuma was a puppet ruler under Hernan Cortez, and through a series of events and the public getting absolutely enraged by this betrayal of his own people to link up with these natives, I mean, not natives, but these foreigners, was seen as unforgivable, and Moctezuma eventually died. Spanish were kicked out, and through another more series of events, a bit of allying with other city-states that were vying for independence, all the manpower came together. Hernan Cortez got a few reinforcements from Cuba, because at this point the king and queen had found out about this. They had also found out about how much gold it was. So by the time Cortez had became the de facto ruler of Aztecs, the king found out, and he kind of chartered it as an official letter of business, right? Because he was doing pretty naughty things. He was going off on this without permission from the king and queen, which was basically a crime. But he got away with it because the king and queen saw many promises in this. So yeah, eventually war breaks out, and between the men of Cortez and all the city-states and little nations, they attack Tenochtitlan, and the Mexicas, they put up quite a good fight. The causeways, which are the primary entrances into the Tenochtitlan capital, well, they got stopped, right? They got stopped over there. Close fighting ensued, and in the result of close fighting, the Spanish don't have the same amount of advantages as they have with their cannons and their guns and horses and stuff, right? You have narrow paths, and pretty much the only thing you can use is your swords. So the Aztecs, they they hold them back actually quite well. But then what happens is Cortez destroys all his carracks, right, or destroys some of his ships, rebuilds them in Lake Texcoco, and starts blowing up some of the causeways with Mexican soldiers still there. At that point, the Mexicans were tired of fighting. They were seeing that it wasn't getting anywhere, and now the ground beneath them was starting to get blown up. So that's when the battle started getting lost, right? The Spanish pushed and pushed, they pushed, and eventually they got into Tenochtitlan. They burned down libraries, and they replaced so many valuable pieces of Aztec history, so many codexes completely lost and replaced with propaganda, because they wanted that, right? Across the seas in Europe, the Spanish was a growing empire soon, and eventually they would be the rulers of Europe for quite a while, right? Especially like under Charles V and all. So yeah, they needed more propaganda because they wanted to be seen as more and more powerful, more and more strong. So they replaced propaganda, and they kind of reaffirmed their Christian authority by kind of quoting like divine rights to invade this land, the savages that were the Mexican people, and ultimately a lot of facts throughout this documentary more or less could have been faked. It's unfortunate. I've done lots of digging. I've done as much digging as possible, but it's not the only way to get pure accuracy. Is simply to go back in time, stop the Spanish invasion, and read all the codexes. That's impossible, right? Even if you were to somehow go back in time, you can't stop the Spanish invasion, I don't think, right? So yeah, it's a lot of things where I'm a bit iffy about should be taken with a slight bit of grain of salt, but the majority of what I have stated has been more or less unanimously agreed upon by all Native American historians and Spanish historians, that this was kind of the gist of what happened. And so, my friends, that was my comprehensive guide to the Aztec Empire. It was maybe not as much as you'd like to know, perhaps, but this was like beginner tier level, right? I would need hours and hours and hours and hours to explain each and every intricacy of each and every part of the nation. And if you are interested in that, which I would highly applaud you if you were actually interested, you can read The Fifth Sun. It's a very good book about the Aztecs. If you're interested in Native American history in general, 1491, Revelations of a New World Before Columbus, another good read. So yeah, all in all, Aztec Empire, 8 out of 10 stars.